Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Menger Institute podcast. We have a very special guest. He's a professor of political philosophy at Nicolaus Copernicus University. He's a fellow with the Mises Institute, and he is a Fulbright scholar and a research associate at the University of San Diego, which we currently are at. Dr. Łukasz Dominiak, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So this is your new book that you've edited along with some of your students. Can you please mention it and show the audience?
Yes. So that's the book edited by three of my Ph.D. students. Two of them are actually already completed Ph.D.s. Igor Wysocki, who defended his Ph.D. in political science around a month ago, Dr. David Menger, who defended 3 years ago in economics, and my current PhD student, Stanisław Wójtowicz. And the book is entitled Reinterpreting Libertarianism, New Directions in Libertarian Studies. And it basically gathers essays written by, I would say, a younger generation of Polish libertarian scholars, in which they present their take on, generally speaking, traditional libertarian problems, but from a little bit different perspective. So problems like voluntary slavery, the non-aggression principle, minarchism, anarchism debate, and so on and so forth.
Excellent. I do want to ask you about anarchism and voluntary slavery. So do we need the government to protect us from becoming slaves and enslaving ourselves?
That's a good question. Of course, the problem of voluntary slavery for libertarianism is a very specific, sort of illustrative problem that is supposed to elucidate the question of the theory of rights and whether libertarian rights, property rights, and self-ownership rights specifically, whether they allow for full alienability. From this point of view, I think we should first settle the question whether voluntary slavery is possible at the level of theory of rights, and only then ask ourselves the second question, which is, well, if it's possible, then maybe we need some institution to protect us against this possibility, right? So I think libertarians are, theoretically advanced scholars that ask this very deep question whether that's possible, and I guess whatever comes out, then the answer to the second question would be no. We don't need government to defend us, protect us, sorry.
Well, let me ask you, where do our rights come from? And what are rights? Because I'm a subjectivist on this rights theory.
Yeah, so, that's a very deep question, of course, highly debated in philosophical literature. I guess... maybe I will give you two possible answers to that question: what they are and where they come from. But again, the caveat is that this is up for debate and it's being debated. I would say that one answer to the question where they come from would be that they are somehow connected with our nature or rationality. Rationality would be an aspect of our nature, and because we have this sort of specific natural properties, therefore we have rights. So that would be the sort of natural law tradition answer to that question. Another answer that we know, of course, is very popular within libertarian literature would be that, which wouldn't be, by the way, denying the first answer. That would be an aspect of that answer, as I understand it, would be that that rights come from our ability to argue, or to have the flip side of the same argument, that they come from our inability to deny their existence without running into some epistemic problems like performative contradiction, for instance, right? So these two answers, I think, would be dominant answers as to the origin of rights. Now, what rights are? Here, I think we can say two things, which would be more or less commonly recognized. So first of all, we would say that rights are basically the normative positions or normative standing that we have towards each other. Basically what they require of other people, how they treat us or treat resources that we somehow came to specific relations with. So they basically describe the position that we have in a bigger moral or juridical picture or reality. And that would get us to the second answer, which would be more substantive rather than formal, that rights are basically some specific properties that we, due to our natural properties such as rationality, that we have. And these properties have it that if other people treat us in specific ways, then they sort of elicit specific reactions, such as sense of blame, moral regret, or leave some moral residue, to use Judith Thomson's famous phrase. So the sort of aspects of our natural standing, if you will. So that would be, of course, moral realist answer to that question, and I would be a friend of that answer, I think.
Okay, but let me ask you: someone, let's say, not so rational, comes along in society, and he violates these rights, whether it be robbing, looting, murdering, etc., etc., etc. I guess my question is this a violation of these natural rights? Because in nature, everything's a quote-unquote rights violation. The big tree outgrows over the small tree. The big fish eats the little fish. Is it different within human society due to this rationale, or is it because of certain institutions that protect us from or incarcerating people who violate these rights?
Yeah, so again, that's a subject of debate. My own answer would be along the lines that, yeah, this is a violation, and that it has something to do exactly with what we call rationality, generally speaking. And whether we have institutions to protect us or whether we don't have them, that would be a separate question, how we should deal with this fact. But the fact would be out there, which is basically there is such a property that elicits respect from other people, and that also sort of causes us to have second order reactions if this property is encroached upon. Reactions like sense of blame. We think that this or that person deserves punishment, or that some sort of compensation is due, and so on and so forth. So I think that would be just a matter of fact, as far as I'm concerned. Now, to the part of your question, very interesting, by the way, why this is not the case with the big fish eating the small fish. I mean, literally. This is not metaphorical question, as I take it. What about animals eating each other, right? Again, surprise, surprise, this is up for debate. We know that the traditional answer would be exactly that human beings, specifically because of their human nature, would be particularly distinguished in this respect. So we would enjoy some very demanding rights, whereas animals not so much. But I think the debate also is maybe, well, to some extent, something should be done about the fact that the big fish eats the small fish. That wouldn't be a traditional libertarian answer, of course. Libertarians would be skeptical about this going this direction. But we know in broader philosophy, this is also a question that is being debated.
Okay, I'm gonna switch it up a little bit. Because I was talking to a friend yesterday, and we were talking about justice, and can you have a market for justice? Don't governments provide justice? But also common law and civil law, because I get confused about it, and I want to ask you the distinction between the two and what's more compatible or in line with libertarian legal theory.
Right. I think. Well, again, this is a huge topic. maybe not so much debated, right? Because this is not a matter for philosophical argument. This is more like, we look at the history, we look how these systems developed, and we derive some conclusions about it. There will be some, of course, divergence of views, but that's a very long tradition, right? And therefore the picture is very complex. But maybe just to, cut long story short, traditionally we would say that common law would be understood as a legal system of institutions that develop somehow spontaneously via separate and only weakly coordinated decisions of particular courts or particular judges, specifically or especially, whereas the civil law is understood, typically understood, as something that is more based on legislation, on codification, that comes from the sort of central from the central authority. But I think that this picture is actually very simplistic. That's, as a matter of fact, is not the case, because of course at some moment in time, civil law tradition was codified, and we know about, for instance, Justinian codification in the 6th century. After Christ, but before the codification happened and before we entered different legal order of more modern European, continental European states, it was first developed in a pretty much similar way as common law, which is via only weakly coordinated decision in specific cases. Now the difference, and I think this is the most important from the libertarian point of view, especially the anarcho-capitalist tradition, the difference between the civil tradition and common law tradition would be that in civil law, these decisions were made by jurists rather than judges. So sort of scholars, legal scholars that were asked by the authorities to give their opinions, called the responsa in Latin, to specific cases that appeared before these authorities. And because they had such a great authority about the legal knowledge that they had, and they studied it for long, and all these schools developed, these responsa, these opinions were being incorporated into the tradition, into the law, and finally codified and passed to next generations. So the difference, if you look at the way these traditions developed, is not so important from the point of view of anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism, because they both developed more or less spontaneously, and only up from some point civil tradition or civil law became sort of codified and legislated, if you will. Yeah,
that's very interesting. You're bringing to mind Professor Hans Hoppel's work Democracy, the God That Failed, when he compares monarchies to oligarchies and democracies. And the idea of, I suppose, punishment theory for the rulers, for the governing class, under a monarchy who's held accountable, he's, as Juan de Mariana, I believe, put it, there's tyrannicide or regicide as an option. And under democracies, democratically elected politicians don't tend to be held accountable for either the debts they incur or, waging the wars. I believe George Bush is painting in Texas privately. So it's very interesting when you compare, the war theory to under these different forms of government systems. But is this something that has naturally developed from civil law, with I suppose under monarchies becoming either above the law, or was there a change in the status of I'm thinking of Frederick Bastiat's work, The Law, that the law should apply to everyone, whether they're a political person or a citizen. Have you looked into this?
Yes, sort of. I did. I mean, the picture that is painted in Hopper's Democracy that failed, and also in his other books, I think is generally correct, right? Which is that's a process that happened through ages, and the process consisted basically in sort of bifurcating of the legal order, between private law and public law, and basically people taking the public position being sort of accountable only under or mainly under this public legal order. In medieval Europe, that happened somehow, I think, around the time when the patrimonial monarchy, which was considered basically a private property of the king, and therefore everything was in a sense part of the private order, developed into the concept of the crown, let's say, right, or the monarchy that is sort of public realm, and then it was taken further and more radical with the absolutist monarchy and then constitutional monarchy and so on and so forth, into a public realm, basically. So I guess if you read Democracy that failed, you have pretty much very sort of concise interpretation of what was going on. But of course, then you would have different orders in the medieval Europe, right? So you would have different principles, for instance, applying to the relationship between the vassals and the seniors in different countries, and also the evolution would take different routes in different parts of Europe. Poland would be here, I think, very interesting case, because after the state monarchy that was created around 15th century, around 15th century, after the state monarchy, Polish development took the turn into what was called the nobleman's monarchy, or nobleman's democracy, which is basically towards a weakening the role of the king, in contradistinction to what happened in the Western Europe.
Speaking of the tradition of anarcho-capitalism and the transition from the aristocracies to monarchies to democracies, we know that anarchy is nowhere to be found historically in the empirical analysis of what we know as anarcho-capitalism. And I'm reminded of one of David Gordon's many jokes, where he talks about the paradox of anarchy. And for the ancient Greeks, they said this is a great idea. No, they said this could work, but it's not a very good idea. And whereas today, contemporary people say this is a great idea, but it can never work. So I want to ask you, where or how do you think the existence of an anarcho-capitalistic order society will come about?
It's about forecasting future.
Yes, predict the future.
So, well, it's of course a very difficult question. I mean, I don't have an answer to this question. I suppose I can give you my opinion, basically. And
if I may interject, from my economic background, I think the best way for this to come about would be the separation of the state and money production. Because as long as the state controls the production of money, then it can continue to expand and grow and sustain itself, essentially. But I just want to throw that out there and see what you think.
Right. That's a good point. I think that would clearly be something that we would be looking at, as a factor that could contribute to that process. My personal opinion, sort of, and sympathy, if you will, is towards, I think, again, Hoppian idea, frankly speaking. He was very in democracy, the God that failed especially, he was very adamant about a change of public opinion. And I think he's right in this respect. That's the most probable way, as far as I'm concerned, that we can think of how something resembling the natural order could come about, basically. Although, of course, on the other hand, saying that is sort of, avoiding the answer, right? Because then, what accounts for the change of public opinion? That would be the further question, how this change would come about. That's a more difficult part of that question, I think. And the role of think tanks, research institutes, scholars working in this tradition and so on can clearly have some impact in that direction, I believe.
I mean, I really like that answer and I really don't like that answer. But I think it's very true. And if you want to discuss further this idea of public opinion, maybe another question to that would be, what's causing public opinion to reject the ideas of anarcho-capitalism? And maybe the inverse to that would also be to support the nation state. And then I think it becomes, the ideas of nationalism, the role of governments in society. I like Etienne Labotte's work, The Politics of Obedience, and the disciplinarian revolution, that a good citizen is one who, I forget the author, but I was reading a good work where he talks about, there was a inversion, a transformation, where the role of the state historically has been to protect its citizens from, foreign aggressors. And then at some point, they changed it, where to get citizens to fight and die for the state, that they said, no, it's your role as a citizen to fight and die to protect the state. You have to protect the state rather than the state protecting you. And so I guess, in the United States, a lot of people have very patriotic ideas. And one thinker I like a lot, Curtis Yarvin, talks about Americans kind of have to confront the American mythos of the founding fathers and this being the land of the free. Because I think from the anarcho-capitalist perspective, that's where you have more freedom. And as long as you have a growing government, then you can never be fully free. And not that there won't be governance and you won't have absolute freedom, but you'll have a different form of freedoms and liberties in this society. And I just want to see what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Well, the question about why public opinion accepts the institution of the state generally, of course, that's a question that we would somehow like to approach, empirically, because that's something that could be checked, basically, at least to some extent. So again, that would be a speculation what I have to offer here. Rather than anything that is based on any kind of research. I don't do this kind of research. I don't know whether it has been done, actually, frankly speaking, as something for sociologists to do. I would say that there is some inertia in people's way of living and behaving. We accept many things just because they are there, and we just go about our own lives quite often, not really thinking about bigger pictures or bigger ideas. And that it's quite often the case that these bigger ideas are very important for young people, right? They're more sort of idealistic. They maybe have less, smaller amount of duties and things like that, and therefore they are more tend to think about these things. Whereas adult people quite often just basically go about their own business, and they take what is the environment. It's very difficult to be a reactionary, I think, generally in politics, whether libertarian reactionary or any other reactionary, because in a sense there is this influence of the surrounding environment on people, and basically the pros of life. These things, paradoxically, they are small sort of that's a banality in a sense, but I think they have huge impact on how things unfold. On the other hand, of course, we should remember that the modern institution of the state, it's a historical invention. It has not been around, since the beginning of time. It was actually invented pretty late in the history of humankind. We could point probably to the 17th century as the time around which something resembling the modern state developed, which is very late. And that also should give us, I think, some sort of hope, something that develops quite late, and might also at some point weakens, or transforms into something less, overwhelming, if you will. So I guess maybe disappointing, but well, this is just sheer speculation, and this is how I see things.
You got me excited to talk about the younger generations and their idealism, because I'm a bit older than you. But have you noticed, as a professor and seeing your students, and even your students who wrote this work, are they more extreme? Are they more radical? I would think yes, on one hand because of just, let's say the cultural inflationary pressures of today. But on the other hand, maybe it's because of their advancement, perhaps, of these ideas of anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism that has come along. And I guess a separate question would be like, actually, I'm curious how you got into your current research into the Austrian libertarian tradition, and in a way, to combine those questions, how it was from the time to where you see it now, especially with the younger people.
Yeah, so, that's my impression, that younger people are more idealistic. Mm-hmm. And why is that? The one reason might be the one I've just mentioned, right? Which is basically they may be not so overwhelmed with everyday life and duties of everyday life. They can sort of think more freely in this sense, like really mundane sense of the word. On the other hand, I think they also, because in a sense they at the beginning of the intellectual life, they're more curious, I think, about many things, and they want to explore, and they want to at least in their thoughts experiment about these things more than people that maybe a bit older. That's also my impression. Maybe there's no really a surprise in the fact that it's quite often that older people tend to be more conservative and take more seriously things that have been around for longer, basically just because they have been around for longer. So that might be another reason. And and the second part of the question was basically how it all started with me, right, or for me. So, well, in a sense, it's also about, I think, the youth, if you will, because I was, of course, I knew Nozick before, but I was somehow triggered to look further, and especially to look into Hoppe's work by, back then, my student, and now one of the authors here in this book, Dr. Paweł Nowakowski. So he was clearly, a younger person who was more excited about that thing, and he got me originally interested into exploring that topic more seriously. And at the beginning, it somehow clicked in for me because I was already coming from a conservative sort of perspective. My advisor, my Ph.D. advisor, and my boss at work at university is one of the most recognized conservative thinkers in Poland, Professor Jacek Bartyzel, and he clearly had an influence on me, and sort of made me open to these conservative ideas. And of course, what Hoppe offers is some sort of mix. as you know yourself, between libertarianism, Austrian economics, natural order, and sort of conservatism, culturally speaking, and that was also appealing, and that's why I guess it clicked in quite right off the bat. But then, of course, what got me more interested was basically working on legal order that would exist under libertarian conditions, under libertarian principles of justice, and this is absolutely a fascinating topic for me at the moment. Yeah.
I do have to ask you, and I don't know if this is a pushback, but I'm working on my dissertation, the economics of suicide, and over, I guess, the recent decades, this phenomena has been increasing. And when you say that the younger people aren't burdened with, having to work, perhaps this is the case. But at the same time, and maybe here in the US it's more prominent, but this trend is increasing. And the economic side of me is thinking, well, maybe it's because of this inflation and financial anxiety and, trying to struggle with that. But I want to ask you, to help my research, what do you think may be contributing to this?
Yeah, again, that's sheer speculation, right? So I don't have any research data on that topic. Probably the research is there, some sort of psychological and sociological research, right?
It is multivariable, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that would be the thing to to look for. But if you ask me, about my opinion, well, I guess, I don't think I have anything original to say here. I think like social media might be also contributing.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is, living under constant peer pressure or social pressure, right? Everything being sort of, exposed out there for the public eye and things like that. That might create some sort of additional pressure on younger generation, I believe. But again, that's just my opinion. So I'm not sure about it.
You got me thinking, and I want to see what you think about this with social media, because it's technically media on the internet of photos and videos, and these things in a way are historical documents. So they're in the past. So it's not even like it is shortening your time preference of like where you're putting your mind and ideas and attention, but it's also because it's historical. In a way, you're going into like a negative, an inverse of your time preference. It's not like farsighted. You're not thinking about the future and planning and acting in this manner. You're kind of like just focused on the past in a sense, which obviously will heighten your time preference. But what do you think about that?
That's an interesting thought, I think.
Well, yeah, because social media is super prominent with affecting people, especially younger people's anxiety, depression, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but I remember when we first met at the Austrian Economic Research Conference in 2023, you said I would fail if I did not cite Foucault and his work on suicide and perhaps the biopolitics. And I still haven't read him, but I want to ask you if you do recall some of Foucault's work on this matter and what you recommend.
Yeah, that's surprising, frankly speaking, because I remember, of course, when we met, and that's very likely I was talking about Foucault. But I really can't remember anything.
Well, it was late at night. Maybe we had a couple beers. I don't know.
I mean, of course, he was writing extensively about changes in social patterns, right? About mental illness, for instance, right? About punishment, all these things. It's been a while, Maybe I forgot. I really can't recollect any prominent writings about suicide by.
Okay, one author who has definitely been very influential for me lately has been Thomas Szasz and his work on the therapeutic state. And I mean, he talks about if you think too much, it's a disease. If you think too little, it's a disease, and they prescribe medications to help with your mental diseases. There's a joke apparently where he said, or someone said, in regards to mental diseases, you have to be crazy to believe in that. But it's very interesting in relation to freedom and the state, because I feel like, okay, if we're approaching a more free society in our persons and property, then one of the remaining domains of freedom and servitude, if you will, is a mental one, an ideological one. And I think that keeps, to bring up Atine Laboti, the politics of obedience. And as Mises mentions, all actions come from ideas. And so if your ideas are one that's more in this voluntary servitude, if you will, then I think it's an interesting place. And to bring back to this, what, as Hoppe mentions, what would change is people's perspectives on these things, their ideas on these things. What do you think about this?
Yeah. Well, this is... okay, let me maybe make two comments. And first comment, coming back to Foucault, mental illness and suicide, right? So now I think I recollected our conversation when you mentioned the question of the connection, of course, between suicide and mental illness or depression, right? And I guess this is what I meant, because he wrote extensively about mental illness, and so that would be something to maybe look into. What I think is interesting about, again, I'm not a medical doctor, of course, right? And this is a serious topic, and I don't really know the research very well in this respect. So that would be just sort of just my personal opinion, maybe based on something I read here or there. As I understand that there has been a development in the question of depression or mental illness generally, taking the understanding of what's going on from some sort of narrative, right? Maybe maladjustment to society, or maybe some hidden drives that are somehow suppressed, and then they are responsible for these things and so on, into more and more, as I understand it, physiology of the brain, basically. So it's the movement is to make it more scientific. On the one hand, it's interesting because of course we have all the equipment that can probably tell us a lot about these things, like functional MRIs, things like that, and we develop in this respect, examining these things, like neurotransmitters, hormones, and more sort of hard stuff. On the other hand, of course, Foucault would be very skeptical about all of this, because he would say this is exactly how the power knowledge relation is operating in the contemporary society. So I guess, just to have some closure with this topic, I think this is exactly what was at stake when we talked about it. And now coming back to your second question about the role of ideas and sort of mental ideological servitude, I think that that's a very positive thing to say, and especially a positive thing to hear for scholars who work in this tradition, because in a sense I believe that we want to have some more tangible justification for our work. So not only solving philosophical puzzles and working within some theory, but also have a feeling that it might have some tangible impact on how society develops. And I think this is exactly where we could look for this kind of impact, and therefore understand our work as a work on a maybe ideal society or utopian vision of society, but solving some problems that this society might face in the future in a safe environment of philosophical books and philosophical papers that later on can be taken by people who are more practically oriented in better conditions that at some point might be implemented. And therefore this work, although at that stage might look like something very abstract and only theoretical in the bad sense of the word, might actually be very practical further down the line, maybe when we are not around anymore.
I think we'll be around. But you have done a lot of work in this field, in your field, and I guess this is a more technical question, a physically technical question, a question of human action, because this is an intellectual institute, and we have our students with the Menger Academy and our future courses who probably are looking to write. And personally, when I got introduced to the Austro-Libertarian society, if you will, it was beautiful and inspiring to see the ability for one to be prolific and write. And I think I credit you as being someone who writes a lot and has inspired me to write more. So I guess my question is, about writing. How do you write, your process? What makes you decide what you're going to write about? And questions for myself and other students that want to write more.
Right. So, of course, there will be some differences because, as I understand, you are more into economics, whereas I'm more into political or legal philosophy. But, with this difference, everything else might be very similar, especially, taking into consideration the fact that economics under the Austrian tradition would be approached more deductively, or, as by method of thought experiments and things like that. Right?
Well, I think the difference is just semantics only. We continue.
Right, yeah. So, well, of course, the topic that interests me the most and the topic that I have been working on for quite some time already is the picture of the legal order that would exist under anarcho-capitalist conditions, or I actually prefer to say under libertarian conditions, which is because there's this problem whether what would develop really via anarcho-capitalist process, whether that would be in sync with the first principles of justice that are identified under the libertarian theory of justice, right? So my work is more focused on the question of, okay, if we take the first principles of libertarian justice, then what sort of institutions, mainly legal institutions, would be compatible with these principles, right? And the institutions that we are interested in are basically all possible institutions that you can think of, right? And you basically go and consult books of law, and you see various institutions, and you can ask these questions. Okay, how would that institution operate? Would that exist, and for what reasons? And basically, that's the general theme of my research project, basically. Right. So, and within this theme, I'm trying to address more specific questions. So let's say we have the doctrine of unjust enrichment. And the question is whether this doctrine is compatible with libertarian principles of justice. How would we approach that question? For example, via different kinds of transfers of property or money or titles. And therefore, we would like to know whether there are some conditions under which appropriation via transfer of other people's property would count as unjust, and what would it mean? And we try to answer this question from the point of view of our libertarian theoretical apparatus. So that's the general research program, and also more specific questions. So how do I write, or how do I come up with these topics? I think the roadmap I've just given, which is basically, I want to know whether specific institutions that might exist right now would exist under libertarianism. Well, the great case would be, for instance, fractional reserve banking, right? Because it's not crystal clear whether fractional reserve banking would exist as a part of free market or wouldn't exist, right? Of course, that wouldn't be sort of coordinated from this, sort of central governing agency or institutions, that would create legal tender and other things that would also, sort of create good environment for that institution. But we can also imagine that some elements of that would exist on the sort of voluntary basis, or at least the debate is on that, right?
For sure.
So questions like that, and how I write, when I have the question and when I come up with some, let's say tentative hypothesis how the solution to that question might look like, then I basically sit to write it as a separate paper, right? So usually my approach would be to take one problem and devote one paper to one problem. When you write, because in philosophy, writing is also thinking. So it's very difficult to basically first, do all the thinking and then just sit down and write it down. It's rather that these two things happen simultaneously to some extent, and writing allows you to organize your thinking very well. That's a great method of organizing your thinking. So even if you don't want to publish, actually writing would be the best method, in my opinion, to develop, philosophically, to develop your arguments, to develop your thinking. And so that would be, in a nutshell, I think, the way I write, basically. Mm-hmm. And I do it, maybe one more thing. Well, I do it every day. Yeah. Basically, because, I got into the habit and this is how I work.
Yeah. And that's professional. But when you write every day, because for me at the moment, I like to write 2 pages, which may take me an hour. Do you go for a page count, word count, time, temporal count? And also, do you ever overdo it? Do you think you can write too much? Which also could be, a problem like writing not enough if you're a writer.
I go for these things, which is I go for word count, for instance. I would say I write very slowly. I think I write very slowly, but because I do it every day, it compounds. And, at the end of the year, I can have many things written and published. I would say that my average would be 3,000, because I count, by the way, in Poland we count not in words, but in characters with spaces. That gives me sort of natural measure of how I write. So I would say my, daily count would be, on average, I think, between 3,000 or 4,000 characters with spaces. And that's it. It's not like I aim at that number. It's basically, it comes out naturally. After 3,000 words, I already feel some fatigue. And it takes me a long time, frankly speaking, to write 3,000 words. Characters, of course. That would be clearly a few hours, right? So, of work. But I don't time myself, or I don't, really aim at any specific thing. Can there be overwriting? I haven't experienced, I think, of writing too much. What I experienced, unfortunately, is to want to write too much, which is basically you want to write too quick, or you want to embark on too grand a project. So in my case would be, I clearly have problems with writing books. It's just, too long a process for me. And maybe too, grand a project to wrap my head around the idea, the entire idea of a book, right? That would be like 350 pages. So I really admire people who are good book writers. I basically don't think I have the skill. At some stage I will have to, publish some books, and I aim at that. I would like to do this, but it's for some reason much easier for me to write a research paper, which would be 20 pages devoted to one problem, and then move on. Sort of, I write it, I forget about it, I move on. I don't like to come back to that. I sort of, settled the problem in my head. I have my thoughts straight on that particular issue, and I move on, and I move on, and I move on. This works for me, basically. So
nice. At the moment, I'm writing my dissertation with pen and paper, and you're making me realize, like, maybe I prefer writing a book versus a paper, a 20-page paper, because then I have to format it once rather than having to continuously format the papers over and over again. So it's just a laziness thing, really. But I do want to ask you, because you mentioned this distinction that you call anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism. But perhaps some people, libertarians themselves, may consider libertarianism to be, both containing minarchism and anarchism, or what's the distinction for you between libertarianism and anarchism?
Yeah, so, of course I'm aware of this debate between anarcho-capitalism and minarchism.
Well, the debate is settled. There's no debate.
There's no debate, there's no debate, yeah, and the distinctions and so on and so forth in the literature. But again, from my point of view, personal point of view, in a sense, I think that libertarianism is a substantive moral theory. Right, that's maybe really unpopular to say it's a moral theory, because we know due to Walter Block, that's a thin theory. It's not like a thick moral theory. But what I mean is a juridical or moral theory, of moral rights, and that they are distributed in accordance with specific principles. We have self-ownership principle, we have voluntary transfer principle, we have again, some debate is taking place, but let's call it the original appropriation principle, and and so on and so forth. We have these principles, and then we sort of can deduce to a point, and also reconcile some implications and moral intuitions with these principles, and we can come up with some description of a legal order that would be just. It would be just because it would be produced in accordance with these principles. So this is how I understand libertarianism. Mm-hmm. Whereas anarcho-capitalism, it's a I would say rather a process or a form than the substance. So anarcho-capitalism would be anything that comes about in a specific process, which would be spontaneous, not designed, that wouldn't have any central governing agency. By definition, would be anarchist, not minarchist, and so on and so forth. And now that's why I approach this problem with some sort of caution, because there might be things that develop in anarcho-capitalist ways that would not be libertarian, right? We can at least imagine this, or at least it seems to me. So there is some tension, I guess, between the process that would be anarcho-capitalist and the substance that would be libertarian. And that's how I understand it. Of course, libertarian principles of justice would give you at the output that would give you anarcho-capitalist society. But the process wouldn't have to be anarcho-capitalist, and the anarcho-capitalist process can give you at the output something else than what is consistent with libertarian principles of justice. Of course, there have been attempts in the literature to bridge this gap. David Friedman, for instance, right? He tries to make an argument that the anarcho-capitalist process, and as I understand his work, that anarcho-capitalist process would somehow, make it more likely, or maybe even guarantee the sort of libertarian, outcome. Well, for me, I'm not sort of persuaded, frankly speaking, but that it would guarantee such an outcome.
I wonder, because I want to see what you think about this, because I don't want to say I'm along David Friedman's lines with that argument, but more in the Misesian sense. Although he was not an anarchist, he retained subjectivism, even when it applied to ethics. And then Rothbard was an anarchist, but favored objective ethics. So maybe I couldn't call myself a libertarian if I favor this Misesian idea that ethics are subjective and evolve from cultures and what they value. But I almost, I don't know. I feel like Rothbard's analysis of objective ethics can be debated themselves. Unless maybe that is the libertarian ethical code, and then something else that is, not those ethics per se, but subjective, maybe tangential, maybe more of like this David Friedman outcome result would be similar to that. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I think that's a real divide as far as the moral theory is concerned. Subjectivism in moral theory, in my opinion, should not have place, right? So, for instance, subjective theory of value, from my point of view as a scholar working within the libertarian tradition, or tradition of the libertarian legal order, does not have place in this theory, because that would sort of undermine the very project, I think, right? So I'll give you some examples. For instance, we would like to have the idea of proportionate punishment or proportionate retaliation for violation of rights. We would like to have a space for the idea that some rights are more, let's say, weighty than other rights. So for instance, my right to life, which is right against being killed, is more weighty than my right to, this copy of the book, right? And so on and so forth. So if you really applied subjective theory of value across the board, these ideas would be, out of place. We would have very difficult time to make sense of them. And these are only two examples. I think you have many examples like that. So I think, I personally think Rothbard in this regard is superior, right? The subjective theory of value works very well within economic theory, but moral theory, or juridical theory, call it as you want, is a different subject basically. And here, value would have some measure of objectivity. And I don't think there's a way around it, frankly speaking. And I think your question is very good, because it really shows that also probably the difference, right? Another difference between substantive doctrine, which is libertarianism, and anarcho-capitalism, which might be open to this subjective valuation notion. Yeah.
I think in anarcho-capitalism it would be like based on the property ownership's idea of what sort of behaviors will be acceptable in their community. And if you violate these behaviors, this code of conduct, then you can be physically removed. So in a sense, I don't even want to call it, morality, morals, and just like private rules. What do you think about that?
That's part of the problem, I think, right? So, basically, there would be questions, I think, that would be very difficult to answer on the basis of that paradigm, let's say. So, for instance, we would like to have, and I guess you would agree, we would have, in these communities, let's say, we would have interactions between people, and we would like to classify some of these interactions as involuntary and some of them as voluntary. Right? So then we would need a theory of voluntariness, which would be somehow a normative theory, or at least will have normative import. Mm-hmm. But clearly we wouldn't like to establish this theory on voluntary basis, because this voluntary basis would presuppose another voluntary theory of voluntariness. And this theory of voluntariness would be either established on voluntary basis or would be substantive objective theory, and so on and so forth. We would have, sort of regressive ad infinitum. Mm-hmm. So there are some theories, I think, they not so easily managed by this paradigm. They require more objective point of view. I think that would be one of the concerns I would have about this approach. Another thing would be, of course, and we know that from real life and from history, it's impossible like practically impossible to regulate all the minutiae of human interaction in terms of contracts. There will always be some slack for the courts to decide. And the courts, by deciding these cases, would be really sort of infusing this anarcho-capitalist order with something else. And this something else will, look pretty much as some sort of, theory that has a different source. What source? I guess the same source as the theories that govern our legal systems to some extent right now, which is some sort of, intuitive, perhaps objective source. So I think, so that would be the problem I would see with this.
I see. But these rules could be, they could be dynamic. They can be subjective in the sense of like based on religion or certain cultural ideas, perhaps.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. 100%. But I think that what we're talking about now, and there would be agreement between us. These are, culturally sensitive differences, let's say, between local legal orders would be operating within some broader framework, and this broader framework would then, in my opinion, would have to be to a point substantive. This is how I see the things, right? Mm-hmm. Substantive and in a sense objective, right? So that would be basically impossible to establish on voluntary basis entirely, because we would have to know what's voluntary basis, for instance, for that reason, right? But also other reasons, I believe.
I see. Okay, I like it. Well, I want to ask you, with the time remaining, if there's anything specific that you would like to discuss or mention.
Well, I guess maybe I would like to come back a little bit to the idea of working on the research problem, which is I think very important for libertarian thought, which is trying to find out what legal institutions could exist in accordance with libertarian principles of justice, right? And in this respect, I would like to mention Walter Block. Right, because at the beginning I was talking also about Hoppe and his influence, with democracy that failed, the sort of marriage between libertarianism and conservatism. It was very important for my development as a libertarian scholar. But the second phase of my development was actually due to Murray Rothbard, what he did in the Ethics of Liberty. He opens up some, important doors for these questions. Sort of, the word is, I know, pejorative in general English, but I think maybe it should regain some sort of, a positive meaning, which is libertarian casuistry, as a case-based method, or dealing with cases. It's already present in Rothbard's work, but Walter Block took it to another level. And frankly speaking, this is something that I personally find amazingly interesting. That is somehow rather absent, I would say, in general philosophy these days. Of course, you have applied ethics and other things, which probably would somehow, be similar to what Walter Block is doing. But this is basically, a fascinating topic that I got interested into due to Walter Block. And well, what else? Maybe I would like to mention the fact, because that's another, on the same note, you answered this, you asked this question earlier, and I answered, about the Austro-libertarian tradition being welcoming for writing and so on and so forth. I think Walter Block is another great case in point here. He's very, productive and very welcoming to any young scholars that would like to either co-author or have, polemics with him and so on and so forth. Really encouraging in this respect, and I think this is pushing the libertarian scholarship forward.
Definitely. So I haven't read The Ethics of Liberty by Rothbard. I'll have to read that. What works of Walter Block on this topic do you recommend?
Yeah, so Walter Block, well, I wouldn't like to compare myself to Walter Block, but I think there is some similarity in this respect that Walter Block writes mainly papers, right? So his books will be collections of papers or collections of some short pieces. Absolutely. I mean, basically, the thing is, any topic you can imagine almost, about libertarian law that comes up, that comes to your mind, you Google this topic with the name Walter Block next to it, and you can be fairly certain that you will find a paper on that topic. So there are some great papers by Walter Block. They really, I think, they open the doors for amazing discussions in the libertarian theory. Let me give you one example. Maybe the paper that I particularly like is the paper about inalienability of rights and the problem of voluntary slavery. I can't remember the exact title. It's a long title, inalienability of rights, rejoined to this and that, typical Walter Block style. Really superb paper. Absolutely. It's not like I agree with everything. I think I disagree with many things. But basically, asking these questions is driven philosophically, is fascinating, is interesting, is inspiring, and inviting for discussion, right? And of course, the topic I also contributed to, we had many debates with Walter Block about, would be evictionism. That's another fascinating topic, I think.
Yeah. You want to talk about evictionism a little bit?
If we have some time,
yeah.
I would love to. Yeah, I love the topic. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a violation of morality, right? No, that was a joke. That was a bad joke, but that joke should be evicted. But please explain evictionism.
So the basic idea is that we assume now. There are many, because this debate is going on for so long. So there are many questions, about what really, is going on here, and what are the positions taken by the participants in the debate. So let me say that. So you assume, for the sake of discussion, although I think that Walter Block might be willing to not only assume that for the sake of discussion, but actually, he embraces the position that the fetus is a self-owner, we would say in libertarian lingo, which is basically is morally speaking a person, maybe not with all rights. Clearly, you cannot purchase a flat or make a transfer, and things like that. But it has all the passive rights, against mostly against being killed, right? So you assume that for the sake of discussion, and then basically ask the question whether under this condition, what we would normally call abortion, although here another caveat, right? Because Walter Block would be using the word differently than the way we use it. Outside of libertarian scholarship, right? Whether aborting the fetus could be legal, in accordance with libertarian principles of justice. And according to Walter Block, more or less the argument would be this: if the fetus is unwanted, then it looks like sort of trespasser on the property of the pregnant woman, and therefore, even though originally we attributed self-ownership rights to the fetus, because he is a trespasser, he forfeits his rights, and therefore the woman might use the gentlest possible way of stopping the trespass, which in the case of the fetus would be what we would call abortion, and what Walter Block would call eviction, basically evicting or ejecting the fetus from her body, which in the case of so-called early pregnancies would of course end up would equal the death of the fetus, or would cause the death of the fetus. Whether it would cause the death of the fetus, that's another question. Okay, so take it back. Would sort of end up with the fetus dying, whereas in the case of later abortions, when the fetus is viable, or at least physically or biologically able to survive outside of the mother's body, then eviction would differ from abortion because it would be, according to Walter Block and the evictionist doctrine, it would be permissible to evict the fetus, but not to cause the fetus's death, not to kill the fetus, which of course then creates other problems or raises other questions. Then if you're allowed to evict but not to kill, but fetus cannot survive unless it's supported by incubator or some other machinery and so on and so forth, then who should take responsibility for that, and whether that's creation of positive duties or not, and so on and so forth. So that would be the sort of the general idea of evictionism.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. It makes me sad to see the conflation of the right to remove a baby with the right to kill the baby, and it doesn't need to be the case. And I think Walter has done a great job explaining this and pioneering evictionism and making the distinction that the baby can be its own life, even if it's removed from the mother.
Yeah, but of course the question is whether he really made the distinction consistently. I think, yeah. So part of the discussion was about that. So in some places, Walter Block says that, for instance, as far as early pregnancies are concerned, it really doesn't matter whether you remove the early fetus and let it die, or whether you, do something that we would, I think, clearly call killing, right?
Yeah.
So that wouldn't matter. But why wouldn't that matter? It's not clear. It's not clear to me, for instance, right? There's distinction between eviction and if eviction is understood as basically removing and letting die in the early pregnancies, then the distinction, from as far as I'm concerned, would be valid even in early pregnancies. So that would matter. Actually, the method of abortion would matter, whether it's just a removal and letting die, or whether that's killing and then removal, as Walter Block sometimes says. And then the same question, I think, or similar question, would also pertain to the late pregnancy, right? So, if evicting the late fetus is basically removing the fetus from the mother's body and just letting it die, essentially, right? Because this fetus, although viable, is viable only when you provide some additional support. Then why not to allow that? Why to, impose something that resembles positive duties? Although Walter Block would disagree that these are positive duties, he would call it differently, and require that someone takes care of the fetus that has been removed. Right, that's another problem, right? So I mean, these are questions that we would like to debate, or we do debate them, yeah, and I think they are fascinating.
Yeah, I think this debate is in its early stages of life. But Professor Łukasz Dominiak, I want to thank you for your time and being on this podcast. This was great.
Thank you very much. That was a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.